I never expected a simple garden could cause a war. It started innocently, just a few rows of tomatoes, some sunflowers, lavender lining the fence. I had just retired, and gardening gave me peace. It gave my wife something to smile about. Our grandkids would run between the raised beds, playing in the dirt. Helping me plant that little patch of green brought life back into our lives. But to the HOA, it was a problem. The first letter was polite. A printed note slipped under my front door. Your yard does not meet the uniform standards of the neighborhood. Please remove the unapproved landscaping. That was their way of saying, kill your garden. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Surely, they didn't mean me. I lived here 15 years without a single issue. But then the second letter came, and it was more aggressive. They started citing obscure codes. Section 9.2.3 of the HOA bylaws. No unauthorized vegetation. I read the entire thing twice. It was vague, written in a way that could apply to anything, so I asked the board for clarification. I was polite. I even brought cookies to the meeting, hoping for some civil conversation, but I was met with glares, especially from Margaret, the HOA president. She sat like a queen on a throne, arms crossed, lips thin like a blade. Your garden attracts bees, she said coldly. That poses a danger to residents. Someone else mumbled something about the aesthetics not fitting the planned image of the community. They voted 3-2-1. I was given 14 days to comply or face daily fines. I went home that night, angry but not broken. My wife told me to let it go. But something inside me felt twisted. How could a group of people dictate how I lived on my own property? That garden wasn't hurting anyone. It was growing food, it was beauty, it was mine. The next morning, I started gathering support. I talked to my neighbors. Some rolled their eyes. That's just the HOA, nothing you can do. Others admitted they hated the rules too, but were too scared to speak up. A few even offered to help me fight back. That's when I got an idea. I began documenting everything. Every letter, every fine, every meeting. I installed cameras in my front yard, and I started a small blog called The Garden War. I didn't think much of it, just a place to vent. But within a week, it had hundreds of views. By the end of the month, it had thousands. Turns out, I wasn't the only one fed up with HOA nonsense. But the HOA wasn't sitting still. They started targeting me harder. One morning, I woke up to find my sunflowers trampled. My tomato cages were kicked over. The gate to my backyard had been ripped off its hinges. I checked the footage. 2 men, masks on. One of them walked like Carl, the HOA enforcer. But I had no proof. I reported it to the HOA. They shrugged. Probably kids, Margaret said. You shouldn't have made your yard so... tempting. The smirk on her face told me everything. This wasn't just about a garden anymore. This was about power. And they didn't like that I was fighting back. The fines kept piling up. Every day, I refused to pull my plants. Another $100. Within 2 months, they said I owed over $6,000. They threatened to lien on my house. That's when my wife started crying. She begged me to stop, said we couldn't afford to lose our home. I promised her I'd find a way. I had to. That night, I sat alone in the garden under the stars. I thought about giving up, about letting them win. But then I looked around. The vines climbing the trellis, the marigolds dancing in the wind, the scent of mint and basil in the air. This was more than dirt. It was my sanctuary, and I wasn't going to let them take it away. So I made a decision. I was going to run for HOA president. I didn't have political experience. I didn't know bylaws like the back of my hand, but I had something they didn't. The truth. And a neighborhood that was quietly tired of being pushed around. Over the next few weeks, I knocked on every door. I listened to people's complaints, their fears, their frustration, and I told them, if they gave me a chance, I'd fight for them too. The current board laughed when they found out. Margaret even joked during the next meeting, we'll let the gardener run his little campaign. But I wasn't joking. I made flyers. Held informal meets at my place. I offered free veggies to anyone who stopped by to talk. More people started paying attention. They began telling their own stories. Fines for wind chimes, for leaving a bike in the yard, for painting a door the wrong shade of beige. The community was angry, and they were ready for change. Margaret responded with fear. Suddenly, I was receiving notices about noise violations. My mail was delayed. A citation appeared about unauthorized composting. They were grasping at straws, but every attack just made my story stronger. The blog exploded. A local news outlet reached out and did a small segment on the retired gardener running for president. The video went viral. With the election only a month away, things got intense. One night, I heard a car outside. I went to check and found someone had dumped gallons of weed killer across my garden beds. The smell hit me first. Then the realization. My cucumbers, gone. My peppers, limp. The soil ruined. I sat down in the dirt, hands trembling. This was war. I called the police. Filed a report. Showed them the footage. Again, 2 men in masks. One of them limped like Carl. The other, stocky. Like one of Margaret's board members, the cops took the report but didn't promise much. Hard to prove without clear faces. The next day, the story broke online. My garden destroyed. Just weeks before the election. But instead of breaking me, it fueled the fire. Neighbors came by with plants, seeds, soil. We rebuilt together. My front yard turned into a symbol of defiance. Kids painted signs. Protect the garden. Vote for change. People who never spoke to me before started waving as they passed. Margaret panicked. She tried to disqualify me. Claimed I missed a filing deadline. Tried to change voting procedures. But I had been careful. I dotted every I, crossed every T. And now, everyone was watching. The HOA couldn't hide behind paperwork anymore. 1 week before the vote, the board held an emergency meeting. They tried to pass a new rule. Candidates must have served on a committee before running. It was a clear attempt to block me. But I wasn't alone anymore. Dozens of neighbors showed up, packed into the small HOA room like sardines. When Margaret tried to pass the rule, the crowd erupted. Someone shouted, "You're scared because he's winning." Others demanded a vote of no confidence. The board tabled the motion. For the first time, I saw real fear in Margaret's eyes. That night, I received a letter. No signature. Just typed words. Drop out. Before you regret it. I read it 3 times. Showed my wife. She wanted me to call the police. I told her I wasn't afraid. Because now, it wasn't just about me. It was about every person in the neighborhood who had been silenced. Every rule, every trampled dream. I was in this to the end, and the end was just getting started. The week before the election felt like something out of a movie. Every day brought something new in, unexpected conversation, a door that opened wider than I expected, a neighbor who whispered, "We're with you." People I hadn't spoken to in years were suddenly offering coffee, waving from porches and telling me about the quiet tyranny they had lived under for far too long. But under the surface, things were boiling. The letter I received, "Drop out before you regret it," kept playing in my mind. It wasn't just a threat. It was a reminder that these people weren't just clinging to power, they were willing to get ugly to keep it. My wife asked me again if I wanted to go to the police. But I told her, if I back down now, they win forever. So I doubled down. Every evening, I walked the blocks with flyers in my hand. I knocked on doors even after the sun went down. I listened more than I spoke. I found that people weren't just angry about rules, they were angry about being ignored. They were tired of being talked down to by board members who treated the community like their private kingdom. And Margaret, with her fake smile and passive-aggressive comments, had become the face of everything they hated. And me. I was just the guy who grew tomatoes. The closer we got to election day, the more desperate the HOA became. One morning, I walked out to find that someone had put up official-looking signs around the neighborhood saying, "Illegal candidacy, don't support a rule breaker." They had my picture on them, grainy and poorly cropped from a screenshot of the local news story. At the bottom in red, it said, "This man threatens property values." I tore the first one down, then the second. I found 10 of them by lunchtime, but I didn't need to retaliate. My neighbors did it for me. I saw 2 teenagers spray paint the word "lies" over one of the signs. A mother pulled one down while walking her dog. By that evening, every single sign was gone. Then, the phone calls started. It began with silence. Just someone calling and hanging up. Then heavy breathing, then static. One night, I answered and heard someone say, "Your garden won't matter when your house is gone." I sat there, the phone shaking in my hand, staring out the window at the dark street. I thought about my wife sleeping upstairs, about the life we built, and I realized this wasn't about the garden anymore. This was about standing up when it would be easier to sit down. I started documenting everything. The calls, the signs, the threats. I updated my blog daily. I posted videos of our rebuilt garden, now stronger and more colorful than ever. People began driving into the neighborhood just to see it. My yard had become a symbol. Margaret and the board tried to pivot. They hosted a family BBQ 2 days before the vote. Free food, bounce house, DJ, all courtesy of HOA dues. Of course, they plastered posters everywhere with slogans like "Keep our neighborhood safe" and "Protect our traditions." But the turnout was weak. Most people had seen through the facade. They didn't want hot dogs, they wanted change. The night before the vote, I barely slept. I sat outside in my garden with a flashlight, sipping cold coffee, watching the moon rise. I thought about all the ways this could go wrong. What if they rigged the vote? What if people got scared at the last minute? What if all this energy just fizzled? Then my neighbor, Dennis, came over. He was in his 70s. Former military. Quiet man, hardly ever spoke to anyone. He walked into my yard and handed me a folded paper. "I've been waiting 10 years for someone to do what you're doing," he said. "You've already won, son." Inside the paper was a hand-drawn map of the neighborhood with every house, marked with a check or an X. I asked around. He said, "You've got the votes." The next morning, the community center buzzed with more energy than I'd ever seen. People lined up early, coffee cups in hand, kids in tow. It didn't look like an election, it looked like a revolution. Some wore buttons I didn't even make. Neighbors had printed them with my name and a tomato on them. One kid wore a shirt that said, "Vote for the garden guy." Margaret arrived late. She walked in wearing sunglasses, her lips tight. A couple of the board members trailed behind her. They looked nervous. The room went quiet for a second. Then someone whispered, "She knows she's losing." Another person chuckled. The atmosphere had shifted completely. Voting was straightforward. Paper ballots. 1 vote per household. I watched as people dropped their slips into the locked box. And even though I knew we had support, my stomach twisted with every passing minute. It only takes one trick, one loophole, to flip everything. I spent the afternoon in my garden, hands in the soil, distracting myself. My wife sat on the porch, knitting in silence, occasionally glancing at me like she was holding her breath. Then came the call. One of the board members, David, the treasurer, had secretly been rooting for me. He called and said, "You might want to come down here?" I drove straight to the community center. Inside, it was quiet. A few neighbors stood off to the side, whispering. Margaret was in the corner, arms crossed, eyes darting like she was looking for an escape route. The vote counters, a group of volunteers from the neighborhood, stood over the table, double-checking results. And then David walked over and said 2 words, "You won." I didn't speak. I didn't move. He handed me the paper with the final tally. I had won by over 60%. For the first time in my life, I felt what real grassroots victory felt like. This wasn't just a win. It was a rejection of fear, of intimidation, of silence. Margaret tried to contest it. She yelled about voter fraud. She claimed some ballots were illegible, but nobody listened. Even the other board members had given up. One of them quietly slid over a resignation letter and walked out the back door. The meeting that followed was short. David stepped up and said, "By the bylaws, the winner assumes office immediately." And just like that, Ty was president. My first act, I suspended all pending fines. My second, I proposed a community forum where every resident could voice opinions before any new rule was passed. And my third, I rewrote section 9.2.3. From that day forward, gardens were not only allowed, they were encouraged. That night, the entire neighborhood gathered in my yard. We grilled burgers, we laughed. We shared stories. Kids played under string lights hung from the trellis. Someone brought a cake that said President Tomato on it in green icing. It was the best night of my life. But I knew it wasn't over. Winning an election doesn't erase corruption. It just shines a light on it. Margaret might have lost, but people like her didn't disappear. They just waited, watched, plotted, and deep down, I felt it. Something else was coming. Something bigger. 3 days after I became president of the HOA, I sat down with a cup of black coffee, a notepad, and a box of documents that David, the former treasurer, handed me. "These," he said, "are the real roots of the problem." I didn't know what to expect. Maybe some overdue bills. Maybe letters from angry residents. What I didn't expect was what I found. Invoices, thousands of dollars paid to consulting companies that no one had ever seen. Landscaping fees charged for areas that hadn't been touched in months. Mysterious budget reallocations labeled maintenance restructuring that led straight to accounts with Margaret's signature. At first I thought maybe it was just sloppiness, mismanagement. But the deeper I dug, the more it looked like theft. Margaret hadn't just been a petty dictator, obsessed with gardens and fences. She'd been running the HOA like her personal ATM. I brought it up in the first board meeting. A dozen neighbors came, expecting a discussion about dog park funding and mailbox design. But when I laid out the evidence on the projector and pointed to the numbers that didn't add up, the room fell silent. Everyone stared at the screen. Then someone in the back said, "She stole from us." And then it began. Whispers turned into phone calls. People who had once been silent came forward with stories. One man said he was fined $1,200 for a non-approved fence color that Margaret herself had recommended. A woman said her application to paint her garage had been rejected 3 times until she gave Margaret a gift card to a spa. Board voted unanimously to launch a full audit. I called for a community meeting to discuss next steps. But that same night, something happened that made my blood run cold. I came home to find my front yard destroyed again, not just the garden, everything. The raised beds had been smashed. The tomato plants ripped out, some still dripping with soil. The trellis I'd rebuilt had been cut down. Someone had spray-painted "Traitor" in black across my white garage door. My wife stood there, her hands covering her mouth, too stunned to speak. I called the police. They filed a report, took photos, promised to investigate. But I could already tell it would go nowhere. This wasn't random vandalism. It was a message, a warning. You may have won, but we're not done. The next morning, I sent a neighborhood-wide email with pictures of the destruction. I titled it, "The Price of Truth." Within hours, I had over 50 replies. People sent messages of support. Some said they'd seen suspicious cars the night before. A few offered to help me rebuild. But what really caught me off guard was a message from someone anonymous. No name, just the subject line. "They're deeper than you think." The message. Read. Margaret wasn't working alone. Look into vendor 4635 and check the contract dates. Someone on the inside has been covering for years. Be careful who you trust. I didn't sleep that night. I spent hours going back through the financials. Vendor 4635 was a company called Evergreen Property Services. On paper, they were responsible for weekly landscaping around common areas. But when I looked at the timeline, something stood out. Payments had been made during months when there were no landscaping services. I cross-checked with old maintenance logs and photos. Nothing matched. And then I saw it. Evergreen had been paid $18,000. In 1 month right after the community park was closed for repairs. But no repairs had ever happened. And the payment had been signed off not just by Margaret but by another board member. Steve. Steve had always seemed neutral. He wasn't loud like Margaret. He wasn't aggressive. He just nodded a lot and avoided confrontation. But there it was, his signature. Not once, but on multiple suspicious payments. He'd been part of it. The next board meeting, I confronted him. I need you to explain these, I said, pointing to the invoices and his name. The room went quiet. Steve stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. Benny said, that's not mine. Someone must have forged it. But it was his signature, and I wasn't the only one who thought so. That night, I got another anonymous email. You're getting close, watch your back. I told my wife I was going to take a break. Just a few days. Let things cool down. But she looked me dead in the eyes and said, if you back down now, they win again. She was right. So I called an emergency meeting. I sent flyers, emails, even knocked on doors. When the day came, more than half the neighborhood showed up. I stood in front of the crowd and told them everything. I showed them the documents, the fake expenses, the anonymous tips, the vandalism. And then I said the one word that no one had dared to say, fraud. The room exploded. People shouted, some gasped. Steve tried to defend himself, but no one listened. A vote was held right there. The board voted to suspend both Margaret and Steve pending a full investigation, but the story wasn't over. 3 days later, a letter arrived at my house. It wasn't a threat this time. It was a cease and desist letter from a law firm representing Evergreen Property Services, claiming defamation. They demanded that I retract all statements and stop the audit, or face a lawsuit. That's when I realized just how big this had gotten. Margaret and Steve were just faces. The real problem was the machine behind them, the fake vendors, the shady deals, the lawyers trying to scare me into silence. They weren't just trying to protect reputations anymore. They were protecting money, a lot of it, but I wasn't scared. I had the community behind me, I had evidence, and I had one final card to play. I hired my own attorney. I used the HOA's bylaws to authorize an independent forensic audit. And then I went back through every payment the HOA had made in the last 5 years. I found more fake vendors, more padded bills, even payments to companies that didn't exist anymore. The number kept climbing. $117,000. That's how much had been stolen or misused under the previous board. When I presented the findings at the next community meeting, the reaction was absolute. People cried. People screamed. People apologized to me for not standing up sooner. They voted to remove every single remaining board member from Margaret's era. I wasn't just the president anymore. I was the cleanup crew. The next weeks were a blur of rebuilding. Not just my garden, but trust. We rewrote outdated rules. We created new transparency systems. We posted every HOA expense online. We held monthly Q&A sessions in the park. And slowly, the neighborhood began to heal. But I knew we weren't done yet, because Margaret, she hadn't disappeared. She had lawyered up, and she was preparing something big. 2 weeks after the audit report exposed over $117,000 in missing HOA funds, my neighborhood felt like it was breathing again. Kids played on sidewalks that weren't buried under senseless regulation. Gardens bloomed wild and beautiful in yards where conformity once ruled. We had started over, but Margaret wasn't done. I got the court summons on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered by a process server who didn't even make eye contact. It was a civil lawsuit. Margaret was suing me personally for defamation, harassment, and emotional distress. She wanted damages, public apology, and worst of all, she wanted me removed from the HOA presidency. I showed the papers to my wife, expecting her to panic. Instead, she calmly poured herself coffee and said, "Then we fight harder." We called my lawyer. He told us this wasn't just about the lawsuit, it was about silencing me. Margaret was trying to flip the narrative. If she could make the public believe she was the victim, maybe she could crawl her way back into power, or at least stop the criminal investigation from moving forward. But the truth was louder now. The news had picked up the story. A local paper ran the headline, "Garden War Exposes HOA Fraud Scheme." Within days, I started getting calls. First, from reporters, then from lawyers representing residents of other HOAs who had dealt with similar power-hungry board members. Margaret had tapped into something bigger than just our street. She had become a symbol. And so, somehow, the lawsuit was real, expensive, and stressful. The court date was set for 3 weeks out. I used every free moment preparing with my legal team. We gathered emails, text messages, audio recordings from meetings, photos of the vandalism, receipts, everything. It felt like preparing for war, a war that started with a flower bed. And while I was preparing for court, something unexpected happened. Steve came forward. Yes, that Steve, the quiet, neutral board member whose signature had been on dozens of fraudulent invoices. He showed up at my door one night, looking tired, like someone who hadn't slept in days. "I need to talk," he said. "I can't carry it anymore." We sat on my porch. He told me everything. Margaret had been the center of the web, but others including Steve had been pulled in slowly. At first, it was small things. Approving extra charges for vendors who didn't exist. Looking the other way when money went missing. Staying quiet in exchange for incentives. Gift cards, home repairs, even vacations paid for by HOA funds masked as board retreats. He said he felt trapped. And when he saw the neighborhood finally saw me standing up, he realized there might still be a way to fix what he'd helped break. "I'll testify," he said. "I'll tell the court everything." I didn't know if I could trust him, but my gut told me he was done lying, and I needed that testimony more than anything. The court day arrived. I wore the same navy blue suit I'd worn when I first ran for HOA president. As I stood in front of the judge, my heart pounded, but I kept my face calm. Margaret, sitting across the room, wore a pearl necklace and a frozen smile, like this was all beneath her. Her lawyer argued that I had defamed her, destroyed her reputation, and led a smear campaign based on baseless accusations and manipulated documents. But then it was our turn. My lawyer laid everything out. The audits, the fake vendors, the money trails, the photos of my vandalized garden, the threatening emails, and then, the turning point, Steve took the stand. He admitted to everything. Every forged signature, every hush payment, every lie. You could feel the courtroom shift. Margaret's face turned pale. She whispered to her lawyer, who leaned in, shook his head, and looked like he wanted to disappear. The judge didn't even need a full recess. The ruling was swift. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning she couldn't bring it back. I was cleared of all charges. The court acknowledged there was credible evidence of long-term financial misconduct under Margaret's leadership. Steve was granted partial immunity in exchange for cooperating with the state's upcoming criminal investigation. Margaret didn't just lose the case. She was now officially under investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and malicious mischief. As I walked out of the courthouse, reporters shouted questions. But I didn't say much. I just said, "We planted seeds, and now we're seeing them grow." Back home, the neighborhood greeted me like a returning soldier. People lined my driveway, clapping. A kid handed me a hand-drawn sign that said, "Thank you for saving our gardens." It sounds dramatic, but it wasn't about flowers anymore. It was about freedom, about finally having a voice in our own community. The next board meeting was the biggest we'd ever held. We changed everything. Rules that had once controlled lawn height, garden colors, and porch furniture were replaced with policies focused on safety, transparency, and community wellness. We created a resident-run watchdog committee to prevent future abuse. We opened a neighborhood fund to support residents in legal disputes with the HOA so no one would ever have to face what I did alone. And then, on a quiet Sunday morning, I rebuilt my garden for the third time. This time, my neighbors came to help. Someone brought marigolds. Someone else brought stepping stones. A little girl from 2 houses down helped me plant sunflowers, whispering, "This one's for courage." And as I stood there, digging my hands into the soil, feeling the earth between my fingers, I finally let myself feel the weight of it, all the fear, the rage, the pressure, and the relief. Because I hadn't just saved a garden, I'd taken back my neighborhood from fear. Margaret eventually took a plea deal. No jail time, but banned from ever serving on any HOA again. She moved out quietly. Her house was sold within a month. No one shed a tear. And me, I kept serving as HOA president for 2 more years. Not because I loved meetings or budgets, but because I wanted to make sure no one like her ever got that kind of power again. When I finally stepped down, it was on my own terms. The last thing I did, I opened a small public garden on the edge of our neighborhood. No fences, no rules, just soil, seeds, and sunlight. We called it the People's Patch. And right at the center, a wooden sign with a carved message, from control to community, from silence to strength. And beneath that, planted with purpose, because sometimes fighting back starts with one flower and ends with a forest.